In a world where everything seems to have a price, what happens when someone helps you and asks for nothing in return? For Matthew Evans, a millionaire used to the power of money, one small act of kindness from an unexpected stranger would shake him to his core and change his life forever.
Welcome to Shadow Crime. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started.
The afternoon sun was sinking low over the Kentucky countryside, casting long shadows across the quiet road. Matthew Evans sat in his sleek black Mercedes, staring at the rearview mirror with frustration. A flat tire. At 78 years old, Matthew had built an empire in real estate. He had money, influence, and the kind of success that made problems disappear with a phone call. But today, he was stranded. No reception, no way to contact his driver, and not a single car had passed in nearly an hour. He sighed, stepping out of the car, feeling the weight of his years in his stiff joints. He had never changed a tire in his life. Then, out of nowhere, a voice called out, "Need some help, sir?" Matthew turned and saw a young boy, no older than 13 or 14, walking toward him. The boy was thin, wearing a faded hoodie and sneakers covered in dust, like he had been walking for miles. But what struck Matthew most wasn't his appearance. It was the confidence in his voice, the way he offered help without hesitation. Matthew hesitated. "You know how to change a tire?" The boy grinned. "Yes, sir. Done it plenty of times for my uncle." Before Matthew could respond, the boy had already crouched down, inspecting the damaged tire. Within minutes, he was working. Quick, efficient, not a single wasted movement. Matthew stood there watching, amazed at how effortlessly the kid handled the job. He wasn't expecting this. A complete stranger helping him, without being asked. 10 minutes later, the job was done. The boy wiped his hands on his jeans and stood up satisfied. "There you go, sir. You're all set." Matthew reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "Here, son, take this. You've earned it." But the boy shook his head. "No, thank you, sir. Just glad I could help." Matthew blinked. "What? No, really, I insist." He held out the money again. The boy simply smiled, gave a small nod, and turned to walk away. Matthew stood frozen, watching him disappear down the road, still clutching the $100 bill in his hand. A strange feeling settled in his chest, one he couldn't quite place. For the first time in decades, someone had helped him without expecting anything in return. And somehow that unsettled him more than anything. Matthew Evans was a man who had everything. A sprawling estate, a fortune built over decades, the power to make things happen with a simple phone call. And yet, sitting in the grand dining room of his luxurious mansion, surrounded by chandeliers and expensive artwork, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, an emptiness he couldn't explain. The boy, Elijah. The way he had smiled, the way he had helped, and simply walked away, refusing the money as if it meant nothing. It didn't make sense to Matthew. Everyone wanted something, didn't they? He tried to brush it off, convincing himself it was just a fleeting thought. But as the night dragged on, the image of Elijah kept resurfacing. By morning, he had made up his mind. He had to find him. Matthew drove back to the same road where it had all happened, scanning the area as he slowed down near the spot where his car had broken down. But there was no sign of the boy. Frustrated but determined, he stopped at a small roadside cafe, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The air smelled of fresh coffee and fried bacon, and a radio played softly in the background. An elderly woman behind the counter greeted him with a warm but curious look. "Morning, sir. What brings you around here?" Matthew hesitated for a moment. Then he pulled out a napkin from his pocket where he had scribbled the only thing he knew about the boy. "I'm looking for a kid named Elijah. He helped me on the road yesterday." The woman's face softened immediately. "Ah, Elijah. Good boy, that one." She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter. "He lives over in Harlan. Not far. Maybe an hour's drive." Matthew's brow furrowed. Harlan. He had heard of it before, a struggling coal mining town, one of the poorest places in Kentucky. Suddenly, the dusty clothes, the worn-out sneakers, the way Elijah had carried himself, it all made sense. This boy wasn't just kind. He was someone who had almost nothing, yet still chose to give. Without another word, Matthew nodded, thanked the woman, and walked back to his car. He typed Harlan, Kentucky into his GPS and started driving. As the city skyline faded in his rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and simple homes, Matthew Evans, a man who had spent his life chasing power and fortune, was about to step into a world he had never known, and he had no idea how much it would change him. The road to Harlan, Kentucky, was long and winding, cutting through rolling hills and stretches of farmland. Matthew Evans had spent his life surrounded by wealth, private jets, towering skyscrapers, five-star hotels. But as he drove deeper into this quiet, forgotten town, he felt like he was stepping into a different world. Small, weathered houses lined the streets. Rusty mailboxes leaned forward, some barely hanging onto their posts. Children rode old bicycles, their laughter ringing through the air, while a few men sat on their porches, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. Then finally, he found it, a small single-story house with chipped paint but a neatly kept yard. Clothes hung on a makeshift line. The wooden fence in the backyard was half repaired. This was Elijah's home. Matthew took a deep breath and stepped out of his car. A woman answered the door, a tired but warm-looking woman in her late 30s, her hands rough from years of hard work. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice kind but cautious. Matthew cleared his throat. "I'm looking for Elijah. I wanted to thank him properly for helping me the other day." The woman studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You must be the man with the car trouble." She stepped aside. "Come on in, sir." Inside, the home was modest but spotless. The furniture was old, but everything was neatly arranged. On the walls, there were no expensive decorations, just family photos, drawings made by children, and a small, well-worn bookshelf. "Elijah's out back fixing the fence," she said, leading him through the house. Matthew followed her to the backyard, and there he was, the same boy, in the same faded hoodie, hammering a wooden plank into place with steady hands. He wasn't surprised to see Matthew. He didn't drop his hammer in shock or ask why a millionaire had driven all the way to find him. Instead, he simply smiled like he'd been expecting him. "Hey, sir," Elijah greeted casually, wiping sweat from his forehead. Matthew was speechless for a moment. This boy had so little, yet he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who needed nothing. "You weren't surprised when I showed up?" Matthew finally asked. Elijah shrugged, adjusting the wooden plank. "Didn't really think about it. Figured if you needed to find me, you would." Matthew watched him for a moment, then took a step closer. "You know, I still don't understand why you wouldn't take the money that day." Elijah stopped hammering and looked up at him. His expression was calm, like the answer was so obvious. "If I can help someone, why wouldn't I?" Simple. So simple, yet Matthew felt those words hit him harder than anything he had ever heard. He had spent his whole life in a world where everything had a price, where nothing was done without some kind of return. And yet, here was this boy, from a town with almost nothing, living by a philosophy that he, a man worth millions, had never fully understood. Matthew had come here thinking he was the one who would teach Elijah something. But standing there in that quiet backyard, he realized, Elijah was the one teaching him. Matthew Evans had spent his life building empires, skyscrapers, corporations, entire industries. Yet standing in a small backyard in Harlan, Kentucky, watching a teenage boy hammer a wooden fence with nothing but quiet determination, he realized he had never built something that truly mattered, and he was about to change that. That evening, Matthew sat at the worn kitchen table of Elijah's home. Across from him, Elijah's mother, a woman who had clearly carried the weight of struggle on her shoulders for years, looked at him with cautious gratitude. "Mr. Evans, we appreciate everything truly, but we don't take charity," she said firmly. Matthew leaned forward, shaking his head. "This isn't charity, this is repaying a debt," she frowned. "What debt?" Matthew exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "Your son gave me something no one ever has. He reminded me that not everything in life has a price. That kindness, true, and kindness exists, and that's something I can't put a number on." Elijah's mother looked at him, the steel in her gaze softening just slightly. "I don't want to help you because I feel sorry for you," Matthew continued. "I want to help because you deserve it, because people like Elijah, people who give without expecting, deserve to live in a home that doesn't leak when it rains. In a house with a sturdy roof, a safe fence, and a future." A long silence filled the room. Then finally, Elijah's mother gave him a small, weary smile. "All right, Mr. Evans, but only if we work on it together." Matthew grinned. "Deal." Over the next few weeks, something remarkable happened. Matthew didn't just hire workers, he was there every day. He oversaw the repairs of the roof, making sure no leaks would trouble them again. He funded the rebuilding of the fence, turning it into something strong and safe, and he built something extra, a small playground for Elijah, so that the boy who gave so much could have a place to just be a kid. But there was something even more surprising. Elijah, instead of simply watching from a distance, became fascinated by the entire process. He watched the construction crews, studying how they worked. He asked questions about the tools, the materials, the measurements, and slowly, his excitement grew. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Matthew, he finally said it out loud. "I think I want to be an engineer someday. Build things, make things better." Matthew smiled, feeling something stir deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, not in himself, but in someone else. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just accumulating wealth, he was investing in a future, and this boy, this home, this dream, was the most valuable thing he had ever helped build. The day the final nail was hammered into place, the entire neighborhood gathered. It wasn't a grand, luxurious event. No fancy invitations, no expensive catering. Just home-cooked meals, laughter, and genuine happiness filling the crisp Kentucky. Matthew Evans stood on the newly built porch, watching as Elijah and his mother were surrounded by love, neighbors congratulating them, kids running through the yard, and even the workers who had helped repair the house sharing in the joy. It was simple. It was real, and for the first time in decades, Matthew felt something that no amount of money had ever given him. Peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm golden hues over the small town, Elijah walked up beside Matthew. "Guess this." "Is it, huh?" the boy said, gazing at the house. Matthew chuckled. "Not quite." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Matthew placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice steady. "This isn't the end, Elijah. This is just the beginning." Elijah looked up, curiosity dancing in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Matthew took a deep breath, looking out at the small town that had given him more than all the cities he had ever lived in. "I came here thinking I was helping you, but the truth is, you helped me. You reminded me what life is really about. And I don't want to stop here," Elijah smiled. "So what's next?" Matthew's lips curled into a thoughtful grin. "How about we find the next person who needs a little help?" Elijah's face lit up, like how I helped you, and how you helped me. Matthew nodded. "Exactly." The boy paused for a moment, then said something that made Matthew's heart swell. "Then one day, I'll do the same for someone else. Just like you did for me." And in that moment, Matthew realized He hadn't just helped rebuild a house, he had planted a seed, one that would grow into something far greater than he ever imagined. Because kindness doesn't end with one person. It spreads. And as he stood there surrounded by laughter, love, and a sense of belonging he had never known, Matthew Evans understood. He had finally built something that truly mattered. The true measure of wealth. A life lesson from Matthew and Elijah in life. We often measure success by the numbers in our bank accounts, the size of our homes, or the titles we hold. But as we grow older, we start to realize something deeper. True, wealth isn't about what we have, but about what we give. Matthew Evans spent decades chasing financial success, believing that money was the key to happiness. Yet, it took a 13-year-old boy with nothing to gain to show him the true value of kindness. Elijah helped without expecting anything in return, not because he wanted a reward, but because helping others was simply the right thing to do. As we reflect on our own lives, we must ask ourselves, have we left behind more than just material wealth? Have we built relationships, made an impact, or inspired someone along the way? Elijah's story reminds us that kindness has a ripple effect. One act of goodness can change not just one life, but many. When Matthew chose to help Elijah, he wasn't just fixing a house, he was building a future. And when Elijah promised to do the same for others one day, it became clear that kindness, once planted, continues to grow. As we reach the later stages of life, the greatest legacy we can leave behind isn't money or possessions. It's the lives we've touched, the lessons we've shared, and the kindness we've shown. Because in the end, our true value is measured not by what we've earned, but by how much we've given.